Good morning, y'all. Van Lufa here. I'm filming this on Wednesday morning because last night I could not film anything because my phone kept shutting off, or the video kept shutting off, telling me I didn't have enough space. So hopefully I've deleted enough to be able to film this darn thing. Welcome to day 12, where I am reviewing and recapping the Derek Chauvin trial. So you don't have to. Today's shirt of the day is not a shirt, or it's not a scrub, it's actually a shirt. And in my opinion, sarcasm is always an option. Okay, day 12 of the trial. Let's get going. I'm a little out of order here. So the motion that came up today was the state objected to showing body cam footage of Officer Chang's camera up after a certain point because on his footage, he was asked to get back into his car and look up Mr. Floyd's name. And when he did, a bunch of personal information came up. So they asked for that to be redacted. And Mr. Nelson said that he would. Okay. And then officially the state announced that they had no further witnesses and that they would rest. Today's defense witness one was Scott Creighton. Evidence, okay, so they were going to show evidence of his arrest from 5/6/19. It just shows the difference when opioids are on board. It is not to be used as evidence of his character. Mr. Creighton is retired from the City of Minneapolis Police Department. He was a police there for 28 years. He explained the roles that he did throughout his career, and he was a narcotics investigator for 22 years. He did a traffic stop that day. The passenger in that car became non-compliant to his commands. He reached in because he couldn't see his hands. He grabbed his hands and put them on the dash and then got him out of the car. He explained that he was turning away from the officer and hiding his hands, so he drew his weapon. The passenger in that car that day was Mr. Floyd. They asked, did you see him put anything in his mouth? No. Was the officer wearing his cam? Yes. He reviewed his footage. Exhibit 1051 was the footage showing the passenger to be Mr. Floyd. The state asked him, you had a gun drawn when you approached? Yes. He said, I shouldn't say the state. Okay. So at that point, that's when the state came in, then cross-examined. You had a gun drawn when you approached? Yes. He said, don't shoot me, man. I don't want to get shot. Yes. You told him to undo his seatbelt? Yes, he did that. You told him to put his hands on the dash? He did that. And he said, no, the other officer said, put your hands on your head. So he did that. Yes. So kind of what they were discussing there was some confusion. He told him to put his hands on the dash. The other officer told him to put his hands on his head. So there was a little bit of confusion there. He was awake and conscious. Yes. You took him out and handcuffed him. He again asked not to be beat up. He stood up. He continued to talk. Yes. The other officer handcuffed him. Yes. And he did not fall down. No. The defense came back. On redirect, another officer on the driver's side was giving commands Another officer was on the driver's side. Yes, he was, talking to the driver. Did you hear Mr. Floyd then, or did you then hear the other officer say, spit it out? And he said, I may have. The state came back. They said, while that was taking place, you were interacting with Mr. Floyd. Yes. So these witnesses were like short and sweet. That's how I like it. Defense witness number 2 was Michelle Mosing. She's a retired paramedic for Hennepin County EMS. She worked there for 34 years. Talked about her education and her career. Mr. Nelson asked, do you maintain records for each call? Yes. Prior to today, have you reviewed the run sheet from 5/6/17? Yes. Were you summoned to MPD to care for Mr. Floyd? Yes, she was. Did you talk to him? Yes. Did you learn what he had consumed? Yes. What narcotics had he consumed and when? He said about every 20 minutes. They were opioids. He told her that he took the pill as officers came up to the car. She did a complete set of vitals at 1:34 p.m. His blood pressure at that time was 216 over 160, and she recommended transport to the hospital, in which they did. It took a little convincing, though, from Mr. Floyd, but he finally went. So the state cross-examined, and she asked, he said his high blood pressure was not new and wasn't taking his meds, and she said yes. He said that he swallowed pills, approximately 7 Percocet. She asked him why he did that. He said because he was addicted. He was able to walk, yes, and he was a little resistant to go to the hospital, and she said yes. He was alert, obeyed commands, appropriate, yes. His respiratory rate was normal. They discussed her report and what she had put on it. And apparently he went to the hospital and was monitored for 2 hours and released. Cheers. That was defense witness number 2. Witness number 3 was Shawanda Hill. If you recall, she was in Mr. Floyd's car the day of the incident of 5/25/20. She ran into him at Cup Foods. She said his behavior was happy, normal, he was talking. He offered to give her a ride to her house. She was going to do that, so she walked with him to his car. When she was first in the car, they talked, and then she got a phone call and was on that phone call for a while. But after they had spoken, Mr. Floyd fell asleep. Then employees approached the car. They tried to wake him up. She said he would wake up, make gestures, and then nod off again, and that happened several times. On cross-examination by the state, was he friendly in the store? Yes. He even did a little dance? Yes. You were able to wake him up in the car? Yes. You woke him up as police approached? Yes, she did. So he was awake when the police came up? Yes, he was. When he noticed police with a gun, he put his hands on the wheel and said, "Please don't shoot me." When coming out of Cup Foods, did he complain of chest pain or shortness of breath? No. Was he startled when the officer walked up and pulled a gun? Very. The defense again said before getting in the car, he seemed normal, and she said yes. Then he fell asleep? Yes. You had to make several efforts to wake him up? Yes. And my opinion with Miss Hill was that she did appear to be under the influence of something. The defense witness number 4 was Peter Chang. He works for the Minneapolis Park Police. He talked about his training and experience. His entire career has been spent with MPD, and he'd been there for almost 4 years, excuse me. He was on duty on 5/25/20. He responded to a call for backup at Cup Foods because he was close by. Is it common for park police to assist police? Yes. They have the same academy and FTO training as the Minneapolis Police Department. He talked about his initial observation when he came to the scene. He did not know Officer King and Lane, and they were, the ones that were there when he got there. What was he asked to do? He was given Officer King's little notepad that had George Floyd's name on it, and he was asked to get back into his car and look Mr. Floyd up. At that point, they were approaching the squad car with Mr. Floyd, so they were up and walking at that point. He looked up Mr. Floyd and then moved his squad car in front of squad car 320. He approached 320, and they were kind of trying to get him in the car at that time, and they told him to go back and watch Mr. Floyd's car. He was concerned because Mr. Floyd's car had not been searched yet, so he was going to go back and watch that, as well as the additional passengers that were in Mr. Floyd's car, who were Shawanda Hill and Maurice Hall. And so he stated that he was focused on them. At that point, another squad car arrived. It was car 330, who ended up being Officer Tao and Chauvin. He did not know them either. He noticed that the crowd was getting larger, and he was concerned for the officer's safety. He didn't go and assist, though, because he was told to watch Floyd's car. He was wearing a cam that day. It was active. He stated that the footage was fair and accurate with what happened that day. He described the crowd as aggressive, and so at that point he was kind of keeping his eyes on the passengers of the car and the crowd. He got there around 8:05 p.m., he thought. Exhibit 1054 was his body cam footage. Shows him driving to the scene. We saw Floyd was sitting on the ground when he got there. He was told to look him up. He gets in the car, then he moves it. They showed more footage, Exhibit 1055, just where they told him to watch Floyd's car. He, at that time, was advising the passengers to leave the car alone. At some point, he must have seen Mr. Hall take something out of the car, so he asked what he took out of the car, and Hall said cigarettes. He stated that it was Mr. Floyd's friend's car. Then when they saw what was going on with Mr. Floyd on the ground, they were kind of yelling out, like, what are they doing to him? What is he doing? Shawanda was saying, get back in the car. Man, get back in the car. They were in real disbelief that Mr. Floyd was resisting and that he was down on the ground at that point. At that point, he asked their names. Mr. Hall lied about his name. I think he said his name was William Ricardo. He also said that he did not give him the counterfeit money. At that point, Mr. Hall even claimed he didn't know Mr. Floyd. But Shawanda did, and he was with her, and he was going to give her a ride. He watched Mr. Hall get something out of his backpack. Then Mr. Hall looked in the car. So Mr. Hall said that he was looking for a mask. So he looked in his backpack, couldn't find it. Then he was looking through the window of the car, and he was told not to worry about a mask. They were social distancing at that point. Then Shawanda walks to the corner to see Floyd on the ground. At that point, an ambulance showed up, and then they were concerned about where his phone was. It was in the car, but they were asked not to get back in the car and get it. The ambulance leaves around 8:30. Officer King comes back. So when Officer Chang had his head turned for a second, Shawanda had gotten into the car and gotten the phone out. They had told her to put it back in the car. They were upset about that. A bystander tells them what happened. So a bystander who was at the scene previously walked back over there once they had gotten him into the ambulance and were telling these two what had happened. They made a comment they wanted to call Sylvia. She was the car owner. And the officer again says, do not go and get the phone. The fire truck arrives at 8:32 p.m. King walks over to it. King tells them that they left. And then he comes back over to Officer Chang. Then the radio says that they're at Park and 36th. And so they leave approximately 8:35. And it just shows him kind of walking around, keeping an eye on everybody. He commented there was lots of traffic, some cars and foot traffic. And at that point, after Mr. Floyd had left, his involvement ended. The state cross-examined. They asked him why he asked Officer Tao, are you still red? And what that means is your body cam still on? And Officer Tao said yes. They asked him more about his academy training. How often do you assist with city police? Not often, unless we're close by. Do you hear the same radio traffic? Yes. So he talked about how he self-assigned himself to the case because he heard noise in the background. Talked again how he saw Floyd sitting on the sidewalk when he got there. He did not appear to be threatening at that time. Once you got back to the Dragon Walk to stay with the passengers, you couldn't see what was going on with Mr. Floyd. No, he could not. When they had him by the squad car, then you could see him. Yes. But he was focused on the passengers. And he assumed the other 4 cops across the street were okay because there were 4 of them. So he just stayed and did what he had to do, what he was asked to do. I have to go back because I was a little out of order. The next defense witness was witness number 5. It was Officer Nicole McKenzie. She was recalled for the defense. And they talked about delirium training, whether the department provides that in the academy. Yes, they do. So you're aware Officer Lane attended that academy? Yes. You had an opportunity to review the PowerPoint in that regard? Yes. Then they showed an exhibit. It was just the training that was provided. She explained what it was, and she discussed what an officer does in the situation. Of note, when Mr. Chauvin went through academy training those years ago, they did not teach that at that time. The state cross-examined. You are trained what to do for, and so you are trained what to do for excited delirium? She said yes. And that is to put them in the side recovery position? Yes. Officers are trained in CPR? Yes. So they have an obligation to initiate CPR? Yes. It's policy. Would you defer to an ER doc whether they have excited delirium? And she said yes. Okay, we will go to defense witness number 6. This guy was a doozy. Number 6, Barry Broad. He is a use of force expert. He retired from being a police officer in 2004. He talked about his education. He started teaching defensive tactics in 1978, so he taught them for 29 years. He was certified by the FBI. He taught about crowd control, talked about different jobs he had had. Now he has a private practice and does consulting work on defense tactics. He has had over 140 cases that he was actively involved in. He has testified in court about 10 times. He is being paid. He spent approximately 60 hours on this case. He charges $350 an hour, and he had been paid approximately $11,400 so far. He gets hired by agencies, and he checks to see if their use of force is inappropriate. And he has stated that there were times when he was hired by agencies and that he did find that their use of force was inappropriate. The weird thing is after this incident happened, he reached out to the City of Minneapolis Attorney's Office after the incident and offered his service. They did not retain him, obviously, but the defense did, obviously. He reviewed thousands of pages of materials, but he was focused mainly on the videos and policies. Have you formed your opinion? Yes. His opinion was that Chauvin was justified and acted with reasonableness and followed MPD policies. They talked about Graham versus Connor factors. He talked about the methodology that he uses in these reviews. He spoke about the levels of resistance. In his opinion, this was not a use of deadly force. He talked about what the relevance of possible drug use has. He stated they may not hear you, they may have erratic behavior, have superhuman strength. He teaches cops to keep a person who they believe is under the influence of drugs handcuffed the entire time. They talked about situational awareness, Chauvin's use of force analysis. He still stated that the officers were justified. They discussed what he was seeing on the videos. He stated it would be safer to keep a person who is handcuffed in a prone position. And then he talked about how that was, for the safety of the person. He asked him, if a person is in a prone control position, if a person is in a prone control position, is that a use of force? And he, again, said he would not consider that to be a use of force. Then they went on to talk about positional asphyxia. He was trained that only obese people who are handcuffed and prone are at risk for positional asphyxia. Okay. Is there a reason why an officer shouldn't put a person in the recovery position? Yes. if there are space limitations. He was butted up against the tire of a car and there was traffic on the street. Then they talked about crowd control. He noticed at one point Chauvin's focus went from Floyd to the ground. It was threatening enough that he withdrew his mace and verbally warned the crowd. And then they took a 5-minute bathroom break. Then the state cross-examined. And they said, you said handcuffed prone is not use of force. Yes. You said because it likely doesn't inflict pain, correct? Yes. If it did, would you change your mind? If the pain was inflicted through the control, yes, it would be use of force. They showed the picture, the famous Exhibit 17 picture of Chauvin on him. Chauvin weighs approximately 140 pounds plus equipment. With someone on top of a person on the hard pavement, would that produce pain? At this point, they had to argue about what on top meant, because the attorney kept saying with somebody on top of Chauvin, and he kept arguing, saying he was not on top of Chauvin. His knee was on top of Chauvin. So they had to go back and forth for a while because he would not admit that Chauvin was on top of Mr. Floyd. Excuse me, I misspoke there. He just would not admit. It took forever for him to say that Officer Chauvin was on top of him. And the lawyer was like, well, he wasn't under him, was he? Like, he was so hard-headed. Okay. Again, they reiterated if it caused pain, was it use of force? And he said if the officer's intent was to inflict pain, then it would. Okay. He looked at the picture again, and the lawyer was like, how is this not, painful? And he stated that the way it looked in the picture, that it could have been use of force. Positional asphyxia as a result of oxygen deprivation, yes. A person's body weight pressing down on a prone position could cause asphyxia, possibly. He described the side recovery position, talked about drug influence and the use of force. They spoke again about situational awareness, includes being aware of your subject, particularly if they are having a medical problem, yes. Such as loss of consciousness, being unable to breathe, or loss of a pulse, yes. Then they just showed a video clip of Mr. Floyd going down to the ground. They talked about crisis intervention and how a subject could be having anxiety or claustrophobia. He said they could. Exhibit 240 was just a better view of this. It showed his Mr. Chauvin's knee above the back on Mr. Floyd. And then they showed a picture of Mr. Chauvin's foot off the ground while he was kneeling on Mr. Floyd. They said if the foot is off the ground, there would be more pressure put on Floyd. It's possible, but he had to consider that Mr. Floyd's movements when he was kind of rolling around could have made Mr. Chauvin be off balance. And in fact, in some video footage, it did show Mr. Chauvin grabbing onto the side of the squad car for a second. And of course, this officer said it was because Mr. Floyd was moving around and he knocked him off balance. So they talked about the force again on him. Oh, also that if his foot came off the ground, would it increase the pressure? He didn't know. Then they took a technology break by the state. They talked about crowds again. They talked about when they put Mr. Floyd in the restraint, there really was no one there. And he stated there was one gentleman there. They showed a video with the one gentleman there, and I believe it was Mr. McMillan. They just showed more videos of the bystanders. At this point, he described Mr. Floyd as resting comfortably on the pavement. Okay. The attorney was very annoyed at this point and continued to be annoyed. And I feel like got increasingly more upset as this interview went on. They showed more videos. The defense came back. They talked about the prone control position. He described where knees and are placed for the prone control position. They talked about resistance. They showed some more videos. They showed a clip of the ambulance showing up, and he described Chauvin's knee as on the shoulder blade at that point when the ambulance showed up. Mr. Nelson agreed and tried to get him to agree to say that clips of videos don't always show the whole picture. Then he asked if a person passes out and comes to, could he be violent? Yes. I think he forgot to ask or forgot to consider that passing out and losing a pulse are two different things. But anyway, I digress. Then the state came back and said, are you still saying the prone restraint position does not cause pain? And then he changed his answer and said, it could cause pain. They said, did you see the autopsy photos? No. Did you see the bruises on his shoulders and face? No. Is active resistance the same as struggling to breathe? He said, to me, no. To the officers, maybe. And then they recessed for the rest of the day.